Hi everyone, my name is Dan, and in this video we will be working on the Land Rover LR4. It's a 2016, and that comes from the factory with a V6 and a supercharger. I have been working on this and making these plans already for several weeks, and I want to start the video now so I can show off our azalea, which is kind of nearing the end of its bloom this year. We are in Houston, Texas, and it is the middle of April. The truck actually lives across the country with my daughter at the university, and she'll be coming home soon. And in about a month, I get to get my hands on the truck and actually get dirty. Mr. Cardinal over there. We will be working on the truck and doing all 100% routine maintenance items. And the reason we're doing this now is obviously because I'll have my hands on the truck. It has not quite 60,000 miles on it. It's a little bit soon maybe, but the guys on the forums tell me that we really need to do this now because the tubing that we're going to be replacing has a tendency to fail. So what we will be doing is front crossover pipe, what we call the rear crossover pipe. Rover calls it the rear heater manifold. As long as we're in there, we're going to do the water pump and the thermostat. And with the supercharger off is a good time to drain the oil from the supercharger, change that oil. And of course, since the coolant system is apart, we're going to drain and change the coolant. Back last December, I did this project on the 2013. And the 2013 has a V8 and just a normal air intake manifold. Obviously, this is the 2016 with the supercharger, and there's going to be more connections and more going on. But in principle, it should be exactly the same project. So I'm going to show you all the tools and all the torques that come out of the manual so we can do this and do this right. And that's very important. There is no single source of this information. It's taken weeks to dig all this up. So as a result, this is going to be a long video, I'm sorry. But there's a scroller down at the bottom so you can skip over stuff you don't want to see. And if something's going by too fast, there's that pause button down there. There will be some text along the way, of course. A word about the torques that I'm getting out of the manuals. I do have a copy of the 2013 and the 2016 manuals. The 2016 manual was gifted to me by someone on the internet. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And some of the torques will come out of there. Some of the torques are not in the 2016 manual, but they are in the 2013 manual. And that one you can buy online for about 15 bucks or so. It is worthwhile having these manuals. There are thousands and thousands of pages of semi-useful information, but it is good to have them in your back pocket. So I would recommend going out and doing that. Well, good afternoon. How are you today? So the planning is almost done. All the parts are here. All the tools are here. All the fluids are here. And we are almost ready to go. But I want to point out this rose back here has been blooming like crazy for about a month and a half. And as many blossoms are on there, there's still as many buds to go. So what a show. It's doing really great. So a word about cost. I'm looking at my notes here. I have spent out of pocket on this project about $1,050. About 800 of that is parts from Rover. About 75 of that is fluids. And about 150 of that is tools. You might not need those tools depending on how well stocked your workshop is. And in particular, the most expensive piece on that is something that we might not even use. We'll just have to see what happens when we get into it. So there you go, about $1,050 out of pocket for everything. And one of the guys has posted online an estimate from his Rover dealership for the cost of doing this project, and it was $4,000. So we're looking at saving about $3,000 by doing this ourselves. Good afternoon. Let's talk about alignment pins. The alignment pins are used when we're putting everything back together, the supercharger and the intercooler, so that the gaskets stay in place. And the trick with the alignment pins, at least as I record this, is that they are just not available on a realistic time frame that's useful for me. And even if they are, we're talking either $170 or $620 to get those. And that's just nuts. You can make them yourself for less than 20 bucks. So let's switch over to the manual now and take a look at what we're talking about. Okay, so once the intercooler comes off and then the supercharger comes off, this is what we will be looking at. Obviously, this is the oil filter, then this is the oil cooler, and then we have our air intakes for the cylinders. And what they're showing us here is 4 alignment pins. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those screw in finger tight, and then once those are in place, we put our intake manifold gaskets in place, and then we lower down the supercharger with the intake manifolds. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4 alignment pins. Once this is all bolted down, those alignment pins unscrew, and then we go on to the next step. And so here's that next step. In this diagram here, we have the supercharger with the 2 air intakes. And the next part is to put on the intercooler. So there's 2 alignment pins. There's one here and one here. And they don't have the drawings for this, but there's one big gasket that goes in here. So we will put the gasket on, and then once the gasket's in place, then we lower down the intercooler, and in this drawing, there's the alignment pins 1, 2. Those come out, and then we just bolt everything down. Okay, so as I stated, if I could get the alignment pins on a reasonable time frame, which I cannot, they would still cost me anywhere between $180 and $620, depending on where they came from. And that's just craziness, because all they are is a couple of bolts. So the trick is that when you call Rover, they can tell you what the bolt is, but they cannot tell you the thread pitch. So when you go buy bolts online, there's a million different thread pitches. So what I did is I purchased the bolts from Land Rover, and I'm going to keep them in the packages. I know it makes it hard to see, but I got to keep them straight. So this one here on the left is the supercharger bolt. So we would need 4 alignment pins of this thread, and this one here is the intercooler bolt, and you can see they're different on the end. And we would need 2 alignment pins of this style if we followed the manual. So that's 6 alignment pins. And like I said, Rover cannot tell you what the thread pitch is on these. Okay, so as I said, Rover can tell you that this is an 8mm bolt, which it is, and they can tell you that it's 35 millimeters long, but they cannot tell you the thread pitch. So the thread pitch is 1.25, and the only difference between these 2 bolts is the configuration at the end. The reason we can make our own alignment pins is because the instructions say finger tight. They never tell you to get them tight. They're just in place to hold the gaskets there. So this is my favorite vendor for getting this kind of stuff. Now you can buy these bolts in a whole bunch of different configurations. You can get them galvanized or chrome plated. I did not want anything chipping off and falling in where we don't want it falling. So these are stainless. And the cool thing about the stainless is it throws almost 0 sparks when you cut the ends off. So I just cut the ends off. Boom. So these are 1 1/4. Oops. 1 1/4. 8mm and 130. Yeah, they would be 140 millimeters long if they had the caps on. About 5.5 inches. So there we go. So because we're going to use these in both applications, you only need 4, and I always like to buy some extra stuff. So there are our alignment pins. Total cost $18 plus shipping. Sure beats either spending $170, $180 at Rover or over $600 from some of the racing places that tell you that they have them. So we'll give these a try, and if they don't work, obviously we'll talk about it later. Well, isn't that just spectacular? It's amazing. But the reason we're back is there's a tool I forgot to tell you about that we need to make. So this is the end off of your shop vac. And this is a straw, one of the great big ones. And these here in Houston, they come from a place called Bubble Island or Boba Tea. And you put them together. And remember, we are working on a Land Rover, so it needs to be aluminum tape, of course. So what we're going to be doing is using this to suck out and clean the top of the engine before we take anything apart. So if there's any particulate in there, which there almost certainly will be, we can suck up all that particulate because we do not want that getting down in the air intakes and getting down in the cylinders. So there you go, make yourself up one of those. Good afternoon, how are you today? Just a quick overview of the general cooling system in our V6 on our 2016 LR4. And here it is, lots going on in there. I'm old enough to remember when we had a top and bottom radiator hose and a top and bottom heater hose. And we changed out the thermostat twice a year. Once in the spring and once in the fall, in keeping with the seasons. Things are just a touch different nowadays, aren't they? And then here's even more cooling system diagram. This is how it hooks up to the supercharger. And we do the work there that needs to be done. So we will be inspecting everything as we go, and if we find anything that needs to be fixed, we will take care of that along the way. So at this point, I need to make a comment about how the video goes together. So I film this as we go, which is to say we're learning this together. And I might not always do things in the right order to make it the easiest. So I guarantee you that whatever ends up in the video after I edit it back together will be in the order that I think is best. Whether or not I actually did it that way is a whole different question. Well, good morning, everybody. How are you today? So we are just getting our preliminary setups all taken care of, and the truck has been pulled in, and it's pretty tight over there, but I can just squeeze out without doing any damage to the paint, and we're getting ready. But I just want to show everybody how we're doing this. The truck has been lowered down. It's all the way down into access height, so we can reach over the top and get in. And when that's not enough, we have a little step stool, and I know from experience working on this one here not too long ago on the same project, that will probably be good enough. So remember a while ago, well, for me it was weeks ago, for you it was seconds ago, we made up one of these guys. And I talked about grit in the engine and not letting that grit get down into the cylinders. So I just want to point out what this looks like as we open it up and we start exploring. So here's the intercooler. The intercooler sits on top of the supercharger, which sits on top of the air intakes. So as we go lower and lower and lower, we'll be able to see more things. But here's a nice pile of grit. We don't want that going anywhere. I want to see if I can point it out to you. Look at how far back we're going. Way in the back, and you see that light colored thing? That's a needle off of one of our pine trees, all the way back there. So there's grit everywhere in this engine. And first thing we do before we're going to take anything apart is we're going to go in and we're going to hook this up to the shop vac, and we're going to suck out everything we can possibly get to. That'll be our very first step. Well, the plan was to say that we were doing 100% routine maintenance and there were no issues. However, I have located a leak, and that leak is of concern. And it's very easy to find, but before I show you how easy it is to find the leak, you need to understand the coolant. So this is our coolant, and obviously that says 50-50, and that's 50-50 with distilled water, of course. And what you do is you buy yourself a little UV kit on Amazon, and I know it's over in the parts list. So there it is. It's some glasses and a flashlight. And I lost my other one. My other one was a pen light. I lost it. So we got a nice big one, and it's a little bit brighter. So just to show you what happens here, here's some yellow zippy ties. And they are pretty darn bright. This is the coolant. This is the 50-50 mix. And that's pretty nice and bright too. So now let's walk over to the truck. So let's move in, and here's our oil filter, yeah? We're gonna look down, see if I can do this reasonably quickly. Right down there. Oh yeah, look at that. I know it's not focused, but you see that little yellow smudge down there? That is leaking coolant. And you can do this on the 2013. It's in exactly the same spot. This is the 2016, of course, and that's indicative of a coolant leak. And as we get further down, we will diagnose where that leak is coming from, and we'll figure it out. But that's exactly how easy it is to do. The only thing you need to do is take off the appearance cover and look in exactly the right spot. So that's something to do with the front crossover pipe or the water pump. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is drain the antifreeze, because obviously we're doing a plumbing project. We want to get it empty before we open all the pipes up. Per the manual, the mechanics manual for Rover, there's really two basic ways to do this, and we're going to take the easiest way, which is just drain it at the lower radiator hose and then use a vacuum tool to vacuum extract and then refill. The other way is you can find every drain port and drain it out every drain port and then refill it using every bleed port and bleed it. And it's much more involved the second way. So I'm gonna take the easy way, and it'll save us a lot of time in the end. So this is the driver's side front tire, just to orient you. And as we go under, now remember it's down at access height. And you know, that's all the space we have, and it's very thin down here. You gotta squish around quite a bit. So again, from the tire over here, and this little plastic bit has to come off. There's 4 of these little tabs, and those are in the parts list. And there's the 4th one. You take your favorite little extraction tool, and you can pop those out in just a second. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so here we are back at the driver's tire, and that little plastic cover is off. And if you're lucky, you can get all those clips out without breaking them up. I got 3 out just fine. The 4th one shattered, so it's always good to have a few around. Those are also the same clips you're going to use on the fender when you do the brake work, so it's good to have a bunch. So if you follow that around, this is our lower radiator hose, and we're going to go after this clamp right here, and that's where we're going to drain the radiator, drain the coolant. And you notice that this is already pointing down, so I know somebody's been in here, and that somebody's been me, because I've done this once before. When you get one of these fresh from the factory, of course, this is in a bad spot. It's way up on top, and it's hard to get to, but I've spun it around to the bottom. You can get at this with your favorite tool or with a pair of channel locks. So when we drain out the antifreeze, obviously we're going to catch it in our pan over there. Please dispose of this stuff properly. Please do not put it in the environment or down the drain. Well, here's the first bit of the coolant, and of course it's Rover coolant, and that's orange or red or whichever color you care to call that. We bought this vehicle used, and I changed the coolant immediately. And because this lives across the country with my daughter, as I've said before, I don't get this back to do maintenance too often. So we're doing 2 coolant changes in 10,000 miles, which is fine. So let's talk about the amount of coolant one can reasonably expect to get out of these vehicles when you drain them, especially the way we did it today, which is the quick and dirty way, just at the front radiator hose. So these vehicles come in different configurations. If you have the rear heat version, it holds 45.6 cups of coolant. If you don't have that version, it holds 40 cups of coolant. Today we got out 15 cups of coolant. By no means a complete drain either way. Now what we've done is I put the lower radiator hose back on, put the clamp back on, but that shroud will stay off, and that will be the very last thing we put on when we're done at the end, because that gives us a spot we can do leak checks at that lower radiator hose. Okay, so let's actually start taking it apart. So the first bit is the air plenum here, and there are 2 clamps to take this off, and then over on the other side, of course, 2 clamps to take it off. And then when you come in here, here's our front crossover pipe. That's what we're going after. There's this wiring harness, and if you pull it aside and you look down in there, there we go. There's another clamp, okay? And believe it or not, they give torque specs for those, 3.5 Newton meters. I think that's kind of crazy. There's 1 bolt here, which is 10 millimeters and 10 Newton meters. Okay, so all the hose clamps have been released, and these bits have been removed, which allows me to show you the next step. And depending on your hand strength, this could be challenging. So here's our oil filler, just to get oriented. This is a vent line running from the valve covers, and I'm going to come over here, and that connects to the bottom of the air plenum, and it's got to come off because you got to get the air plenum off. And it's this connector here, and this little knurly bit here. There's a knurly bit on the back. You have to squeeze those together, and once you do that hard enough, this will come apart. Well, good morning. How are you today? So, when we left last night, this was the connector you're having a hard time getting off between the air plenum and the vent line on the valve cover. And the reason was that these coolant lines were in the way and I couldn't get my hand in there. So if you follow the coolant lines down towards the front, you can see they come to this Y, and take a look here. And you can see this little blue tab here. I'm sorry, it's not quite focused. It's a little blue tab. There's one on each side. You squeeze those in, and when you squeeze those in, then this pops out. And then when that pops out, you can pull it back out of the way. And you get your hand in there, and you squeeze this on both sides, and then it pops off. Just don't forget to slide these heavy plastic lines out of these little retaining U spots. And at that point, all you need to do is take the air plenum and wiggle it out, and out it comes. Well, good morning. Another fine day. We really need this rain, so I'm looking forward to it. And let's get started for today. Okay, so we're trying to get these coolant pipes out of the way so we can get down to the intercooler. And this is where we left off last night. We took this apart. I cleaned all the particulate out of here because there's lots of particulate in the engine. Covered that up so we don't get junk in it during the process. And it's proving more challenging than you might think just to pop these off. So first thing we're doing is taking these little clips off. And if you're lucky, you can get through this without buying new ones. And we'll see how it goes. You just go in here with a screwdriver and you pry it apart. And then this peels back. And hopefully when I bend that back, I can pop this out without breaking the clip off. But the real challenge is here with these connectors. These are tough. The way these work is you have to push these in all the way towards the engine. And then there's these tabs on either side. You squeeze in on the tabs and then pull it out. So we've gotten 3 of those connectors off, but you can see this 4th one here. There's no way to get a finger underneath there to push that tab. So let's follow this line, and it comes down and it comes here, and this is the top radiator hose, which needs to come off anyhow. So I've gone and taken it off on this end, on the other end, and then right here I've taken it off. So now I can take this and I can rotate this up, and now I get my fingers on it. Okay, so the next thing to do is to take this vent line off. This vent line has these little squeezy guys on the sides. Again, you squeeze and you pull it off. That comes from the valve cover over on the passenger side. And when you follow it around in the back, there's another fitting just like that. So we're going to disconnect it back there. But what I want to point out here is the oil that comes back up. And it comes in just behind the intake manifold. And we will talk about what that oil does to our valves a little bit later on. Okay, so the next part is to remove this little vent line here, and it connects here. You just squeeze in and it pops right off. I've already removed it so we can take an easier look at it. So there's the line on top. There's a couple little Christmas tree connectors back there, and then down on the supercharger there's another little connector where you squeeze the squares and it pops right off. This is a little stick, and on the bottom of the stick there's a fir tree connector. So just some gentle twisting with a pull up, and up it comes. And this is yet another new kind of electrical connector This is interesting. So you see it's in there. This pulls out. I pull that out, and then you squeeze and pull. Okay, the next thing to do is the fuel line. Let's start over here so we know where we are. Fuel line has 4 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are T30s and 8 Newton meters. T30s, 8 Newton meters. Okay, and now for the fuel line itself. Of course, this is the fuel line. We're over here on the driver's side. The easiest thing to do is take the oil filler cap off, pull the foam and the vent line back, and you can follow that fuel line around, and you can see it down in there. And over on the passenger side, same thing. You pull the foam off, and you can get at the nut. So this is a high pressure fuel line. Gasoline is going to come out when you crack that first nut. And I like to do it here on the passenger side because there's more space and I can get in there and work a little bit easier. And the right tool for that is a crowfoot, and this is 17 millimeters. You know, at the other side of the project, when we get there, that's 21 Newton meters. So again, 17 millimeters, 21 Newton meters. I've covered up the 2 female ends down in the engine with some baggies, and I've covered this one up, and I'm about to do this one, but I just want to show you that these are flange fittings. And the reason the torque is so important is that flange fittings are very easily deformed, and it's a high pressure fuel line, and we do not want to deform these when we put it back together. So it appears that this vent line here is the next piece to come off. And if you've ever taken the headrests off, you recognize this. This is the same little push button that we have on the headrests. So this pushes in, and then you can pull it up. That's easy enough. And this runs down, and it disappears here behind our foam. And I've tried to video it, and I cannot make it make sense in the video. But anyhow, it goes down. There's that, whatever this is, here. It goes into there, and then it goes back, and it goes back, and it comes up again, and then it connects right here. And this one is one of those connectors with the little blue tabs. So you push the blue tabs on the other side, and that'll pop apart. So then there's this little connector here. Sorry about the shadows. There's this little connector here that holds it in place. And then this is a T30. And if there's a torque spec, I cannot find it, but I can tell you it was pretty loose when it started to come out. So I'm gonna go ahead and have at that and see if I can dig that out. Okay, that wasn't too bad. It wasn't real pretty, but something I need to point out here, whatever this thing is, there's an electrical connector on it. And let's see if I can do this with just 2 hands on the phone. Nominally, it's a squeeze, and you squeeze on the back side there, but it really doesn't work. So you got to get in here with a screwdriver and pry that open. And then once it's pried open, then you can squeeze it some more and it'll pull off. So there's this little vent hose. This is the bit that goes right here. It goes back to this. There's a little thing that just slides on and off. This goes down under the foam, and then this comes back up and around and connects to this guy with the blue tabs, and then there's that electrical connector. Very interesting. Okay, so this might not be necessary, but here's that vent hose that connected to the air plenum. This goes in the back, and it connects in the back to the valve covers with another one of these squeeze connectors. And this is the intercooler, and here's the supercharger. So it's, maybe we can get away without taking it out, but I'm just gonna go ahead and do that just to get it out of the way. So before we get there, there's this wiring harness, and this wiring harness has one of these little Christmas tree zippy ties that goes on the front crossover pipe. I finagled it out. There are new ones in the parts list, and we'll see how it fits back, and we might just replace that with a new one when we get there. But these 3 connectors are interesting. There's 2 connectors over here, and you can see this one's already off. and this one is partially off. These are both exactly the same, and I got to point this out. So here this is. What you do is you pry the gray part up, so vertically up, and when you pry it vertically up, it will clear this little tab, and then you can pull it off. So if I can get a shot here, see there, I've pried the little gray part. In this case, it would be down, and now it'll slide right off, no problem. Now, this one over here is interesting, and it's already loose. So with this one, first thing you have to do is, this red bit is up here. You need to pry the red bit, slide it back. So you slide it back. Then, once the red bit is slid back, you can push down here, and then it slides off. Got that? Okay, so let's go on a journey to the back side of the engine right now. Our next step is to take off the appearance cover bracket. So there's the appearance cover where it slides on, and there's the bolts, one on each side, and those are 8 millimeters and 10 Newton meters. 8 millimeters and 10 Newton meters. So we'll take that bracket off. Good morning to you again. How are you today? Okay, so let's get on with the day. The very next thing to do is to take off these bolts right here. 1, 2, that hold the plastic cover for the wiring harness to the bracket, and those are T30s. I cannot find a torque spec for those, but those are T30s. I will do those next. That's the bracket. You see it goes down, and there's a standoff, and on the other side of that standoff, on the back side that we cannot see, is a T30. There's a little Christmas tree connector there that's holding a wiring harness, and then this little wiring connector is on a slider. So the trick is getting in there to that T30. Like I said, it's kind of tight back on the passenger side. And this is the way it needs to work. We need to take a little T30 on small vice grips. It's the only thing that's going to get back in there. But that hole there, that's where that yellow Christmas tree connector was. And behind it, now we can see there's a little gray bit with the white circles on it. That looks to be an electrical connector, and I think all they're doing is hanging it on the bracket. But I cannot get to it right now, and that's going to have to wait until the intercooler comes off, because the intercooler is still holding the bracket. Once the bracket releases, we'll get back there and see what's going on. Okay, let's move over to the plumbing now for a while. So this is our front crossover pipe, and it goes down to about here, and then it goes another 6 inches down, and that's the second half of the front crossover pipe, which is why we need to take all this stuff apart. So this is attached with 1, 2 T30s, and we're going to take all this plumbing out, and then this is the thermostat, and then right there, down there, there's another T30. There are no torque specs for these in the manual. I'm going to go ahead and call them 10 Newton meters based on what we find in the manual for the 2013. So here, I want to just point this out. This is the water pump. This is a little piece of plastic. It's a little plastic elbow. And if this truck lived at home, I would probably go back with the same one. But it's a known weak spot for leaks. So I have purchased a new little plastic elbow. Trick is to get that little piece of plastic, we need to get this whole assembly. So we had to buy this whole assembly to get that one little piece. So we're replacing that. There are some discussions online about replacing that with a bronze elbow. And guys, I have a PhD in chemistry, and you can go look up those discussions. And what concerns me about going back with the brass or the bronze is that that's another material of construction, gives us opportunities for corrosion, gives us opportunities for reaction with the coolants. You do what you want, of course. I like the idea of metal in there rather than plastic, of course, but I'm going back with plastic because the alternatives just concern me a little bit. Okay, so it has been many hours, many unpleasant words, much knuckle scraping, much unpleasantness. I hurt, and I'm tired, and I'm fed up. But I want you to see what's going on here, because I just spent $290 I was not planning on spending, because most of that I really didn't quite understand what was going on. So this is the top half of the front crossover pipe. We've seen that before, and that goes into this piece here, and we've talked about this before. This is that little piece where that little elbow is on, and that little elbow goes into the water pump. This also goes to the water pump, and the challenge with this is that this welds itself to the water pump, and by the time you get it off, you have tortured this rubber enough that I don't trust it anymore. So I bought one of these. I was not planning on it. So that was about 50 bucks at my local Rover dealer, but they had it in stock, so fine. So then both of these lines come down and they go to the thermostat. And the thermostat has an electrical connector on it. And we've seen that kind before. We pull that little gray bit back and then we squeeze down and then it slides off. So it's not bad. The challenge is there's a wiring harness that runs down here, and they have attached it here, and they've attached it here with some fir tree, Christmas tree, zippy ties, and it's painfully difficult to get at just because of the location, but you can eventually get in there and you can cut it loose. And then that wire actually runs down and it goes to this sensor. And this connector is one of those ones. There's a gray bit here, and you just push in right here on the gray bit. Once you push in way up in the top, you push in and then it slides off. That's not too bad either. So here's the challenge. This hose I was not planning on getting. So this goes to the bottom radiator. This is not the bottom radiator hose we just drained at. This one is about 3 inches vertically up from the hose we drained at. This is very hard to get to, and it's, just leave it at that. So the challenge here is that the this bit here on the bottom of the thermostat, this really should slide off, one would think. And there's a wire bail that goes in there and it holds it in place. And as near as I can tell, it should slide off. I went to the dealership, and you know, dealerships are not always very useful and not very friendly. They told me that once this goes together, it's together forever. And the trick is that this little bit of plastic is only available when you buy it as part of this assembly. Okay, so to get this piece of plastic, you have to buy this whole piece, and this was about 250 bucks. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to go get the new pieces so you can see what I'm talking about. So I'll be right back. Okay, so here's the new thermostat and the new assembly, and you can see that that looks different than this, and that's because to get it apart I had to take this off, take the hose off here, and this piece of plastic has permanently attached itself up here, right? So I'll give you a second to take a look at that. So like I said, the dealership tells me that once that goes together, it's together forever. And so the only way to put everything back together with a new thermostat is to get a new piece of plastic, and that comes with the $250 hose. So very frustrating, But that's the way it is, and that's how it goes. So now that it's apart and we've seen how it goes, here's how it should come apart. At least I think. So there again, there was two T30s on the upper crossover pipe. There was a T30 down here on the thermostat, and those weren't too bad. This one's going to be a little tricky not to drop when it goes back together, so you need to be careful with that one. And rather than take it apart piecewise, you can just take it apart as one big assembly, I think. So you would take off this little bit from that little elbow. You would, since you're going to sacrifice this anyhow, you know, it might just be easiest to go in here with a hacksaw and cut it off, because the water pump is going away anyhow, and we don't care if this stays on the water pump, and we're going to get a new one. So that might just be easiest just to cut that, because remember that's welded to the water pump. And then there's a hose here and a hose here, and then the disconnection way at the end. So really, if you, and again, this is hard to get to, so rather than take the whole thing apart, you could take it apart here, 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 and there, and everything would come out more or less as one big unit. Just a suggestion. Good morning. How are we again today? So we are moving forward, but before we go anywhere, it's housekeeping time again. Remember I talked about grit and keeping the grit out of the cylinders. Well, when that intercooler comes off, the cylinders are open, and we don't want nasty grit everywhere. And this seam right here is where it's going to come apart. So that is getting close to the air intakes. We don't want that hanging around. This pile over here, back there in the shadow. So time to break out the shop vac and get busy. Okay, well, it is time to take off the intercooler. How about that? So as we do that, let's just take a look at some of our bolts. So the bolts are all T40s that go around the outside, and this one here and this one here are both long, and those go all the way down. You can kind of see that they go all the way down to the block. And then in the middle, we have those those are 10 millimeters. And there may or may not be some more long ones in the back. I don't know. We'll find out. So they're either T40s or 10 millimeters, but they're all 25 Newton meters. And right now, I'm going to put in the torque diagram, and it'll be here for reference when you need it. Okay, so all the bolts are out, and we have three types. Most of them are these little short guys. Then there's the ones with the square heads. There's 4 of these. And then there's 2 of these long ones that we've already pointed out. And they live in positions 21 and 22. And like all the other bolts from our project, go in a bin. They get sealed up. They're labeled. And they live back here. So that when we get to the other side, hopefully we can unscramble it all. So the intercooler is about to come off. I don't want to goober up the mating surfaces, so this is my table saw. I've got an old towel down, nice and soft. Now let's go back over to the engine. There's a gasket down there, and the gasket's a big gasket, and it runs through the whole thing. There are several locations in the mechanics manual, and they say to reuse the gasket. So When that pops off, we're going to be careful so we don't damage it, and we'll take a look at that when we get it apart. Okay, so that released very, very easily. It popped up and it lifted off just beautifully. But of course, we did not plan enough in advance. Remember what those are? Those were what? Those are coolant lines. So you pick it up, and I have antifreeze all over the garage floor, which I have now cleaned up, and I have water all over the garage floor again. But I've never taken one of these apart before, so if you haven't, let's take a minute and we'll see how it works. So I'll do this without trying to make everybody dizzy. So the air comes in through the throttle body, comes back in through here. You know, here's our pulley on the snout, spins the vanes, lots of pressure in here in this chamber. And then that's this chamber here. The air is going to flow through the heat exchangers, the radiators, whatever you care to call them, through. Of course, that'll be down in the engine, right? And then down through the air intakes down into the cylinders. Pretty interesting. So we can see there's plenty of oil up in here. Wow, hadn't seen that big one. Plenty of oil up in here, and that is not to be unexpected, of course. You know, with today's engines, we have those vent lines on our valve covers. Remember, here's one of them, and the other one came in over here on the air plenum, and that's going to come in. So that oil mist from the valve covers is going to come in here. Obviously, it's going to collect, and then it's going to go down into the cylinders, and we're going to take a look at those intake valves when we get there. Let's go back to the intercooler. So this gasket is not really what I was expecting. It looks pretty good. We have not damaged it, so I think we will just leave it be. So I'm going to go ahead and, while it's probably not necessary, I'm going to clean this up, and then I'll sop up all that oil over there at the supercharger so we don't get covered with oil when we take that off. And that step seems to have gone fairly well. Okay, so the very first bolts I took out were the bolts that hold this bracket in the back, and it's amazing how much more space there is in the back just from removing the bracket. But the bracket attaches to the intercooler here and here. It goes on top of the intercooler, and then the little box for the wiring harness attaches here and here, and the box goes on top of the bracket. Then if we turn it a little bit like this, it attaches to the supercharger here and here. Those are T30s. There's a little slider for that electrical holder. Here's where the yellow Christmas tree connector went. And on that little gray part we talked about yesterday, that has a Christmas tree and a locating tab. So that is how that's going to go back together. And speaking of going back together, I'm going to just put this over here in our pile. And I'm just going to throw it in the box. You think that's ever going to go back together? I guess, I don't know, but I hope so. So before we take this apart, let's think about putting everything back together. Do you remember our alignment pins that we made? And here's one of our alignment pins, and it is screwed in position 17, which is the position, and then the other position is position 10, which is this back corner, and you can see there's limited clearance here because of the coolant line. But so this pin, obviously, if I go back here, that's right here, and then I need thickness for the intercooler. So we would need to cut this off, you know, probably down around here, just so it's tall enough that the intercooler can fit over it and we still have enough to get on it and unscrew it. And that clearance would work fine back there at position 10 as well. Okay, so we are actually very close to taking the supercharger off, but before we do that, there's a few more things to take a look at. So here we're looking at the throttle body, and there's a coolant line on the right-hand side of the throttle body. And the easiest way to get that coolant line disconnected is to see where it goes. And it comes over here to these guys. And just to reference, there's our reservoir. So that's the easiest place to take that apart, right there. So back to the throttle body. And over on the other side of the throttle body, there's another coolant line. There it is. And that coolant line goes down, and it actually goes under the supercharger, and it works its way back, and it comes out on the back side right there, and that's it. And you see that decal again, that's the rear crossover pipe that we're going after. There's a couple little hooky clips where it hooks in, and then eventually comes over here, more or less on the passenger side, and there's a hose clamp, and that is where it goes onto the rear crossover pipe. And the easiest way to get that, as you can see, that's a little 5-inch vice grip, so you can get on that clamp pretty easily, and that's already almost off. But the trick is that when you're doing that, don't be leaning on this guy or that guy. I really don't want to have any accidents. So as long as you're cautious about where your elbows and your arms are going, this is not too bad a job. Take the belt off the snout. And I apologize, but there's no good way to get this little section of video. So if you look down there, this bit here, where the light's shining, that's the tensioner. Okay, all we need to do is release the tension, and that'll loosen the belt, and then we just slide it off the pulley. So down there is a square fitting for 3/8. And if you're like me, of course, your breaker bar is 1/2 inch. So you just take your 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter, put it on your breaker bar. And I'm gonna go install that, and then I'll come back. Okay, so this little bit is easy enough. I can even record it while I do it, even with one hand on the phone. So there's the tensioner, and the breaker bar has been attached. I've got a nice little piece of copper pipe up here. The only trick here is to watch out for the mass airflow sensor so we don't bang that up. But it's really easy. It's an easy push down towards the passenger side. And I'm just going to rest the phone here. Just pops up, and it comes off. Lay it down. And then just a simple release, watching out for a sensor. And we're done. Well, this is interesting. So come in here, and here's the snout on our supercharger. So I can do this, and the turbines don't spin. I did find one video last night that says that if that's going on, we are in need of a new coupler. Interestingly enough, last night I did order a new coupler, so that'll be here in a few days, and we will take the supercharger apart and put in a new coupler and change the oil a little bit later in the project. So our next step is to unbolt from the block, and as I said before, I like to unbolt in reverse torque order, and the torque order here is really very loosey-goosey. Torque order is the middle 2, then the left 2 outer, then the right 2 outer. So to do backwards, I'll just reverse that order and I'll take them off. And I will post that torque order right here, so it's in here for reference. Those bolts came out absolutely no problem. So for reference, those are 10 millimeters and 25 Newton meters. 10 millimeters, 25 Newton meters. And so before we pull this off, I put in one of our alignment pins. Now we're gonna need 4 of those, 1, 2, and then the outer 2 on the other side. We need 4 of those when we put this back in, and that is a loose gasket, so we will need those. So I've done the measurements, and this alignment pin, as we have manufactured it ourselves, is just fine. It's a good height, so we don't need to make any changes there. Okay, so there remains an electrical connector that needs to come off of the back side of that air intake, and I'm going to show you where that is. And it's easy enough to look at, but it is very, very challenging to do anything with, because you see here, it's behind so you can't get your head in there, you can't see it. And it's easy enough when you can hang the phone over the edge and take a look. That's it. It's also very hard to get back there with your hands and with any tools. And I've spent a huge amount of time trying to get that guy off. I'm very close to just cutting the wires and putting in a splice. Not quite ready to do that, but we'll come back and give you a report on what exactly happened. Well, I finally did get that connector apart. It literally took about 4 or 5 hours just for that one connector. Like I said, there's no way to see what's going on back there because you can't get your head back there. So quite literally, you lay the phone right here and you hang it over the edge so it's pointing down, and so then you have a display screen. And you can see what's going on. And because I'm right-handed, I need to go in with my right hand with my tools, and then I need to go around the other side with my left hand with the flashlight. So my arms are crossed, and I'm laying on the truck, and I'm up on the step stool. And I want to take a moment now to take a look at that connector and try and explain exactly how that works, because as we go around, you can see why it's so hard to get that connector, because we've got the firewall back here, we've got the wiring harness back here, we have the shroud up top. So there's a little retaining clip, right? So that's what's holding everything in place. And the way this connector is supposed to work, and I need to switch hands here on the phone, sorry. There we go. The way this is supposed to work is you're supposed to push in here, right there at those 2 little lines. And when you push in, can you see that? That moves up and down. Except it doesn't. It's stuck. It's full of gunk, and it's nasty. So what I had to do is I had to go in with a paint can opener, and I went in and I pried that up. I got in there and I pried it up, and then once I got pried up, then the toggle loosened just enough, and between prying and working the toggle and then working it off, it eventually came off. But that's a tough one. Well, today's been an easy day so far, and thank goodness, but it just got a little more difficult. So I tried pulling this up by hand, and it's clear this is not going anywhere. And then I remember that there are 2 dowel pins, and the dowel pins go from the bottom side of the supercharger down into the block. Sometimes it comes apart easily, and other folks report that it is just a bear to get apart. And I was able to find out about where those live. So towards the back side of the second cylinder up, so kind of more or less under this bolt and more or less under that bolt going down into the block. So the recommended route now is to use an engine hoist, which I have purchased in advance thinking we might need it, and we're going to go ahead and get that set up and see how it comes along. Okay, so it has taken a while to set up. Actually, it took about an hour and 45 minutes to set up, and I've been working at it for about 15 minutes or so now, and it's under a lot of tension. And this supercharger is being challenging, but it is coming off. So the information on this particular hoist is up front in the tools list, but I want to show you the hoist. I like it a lot. It's pretty cool. So over on the sides, we have, this goes through, and even under all that tension, you can still rock that a little bit. It's meant to do that. And then we have some nice rubber feet down there, and so we're not going to scratch anything up. And you notice that this is fully extended, absolutely all the way. I measured that 4 times before I bought it, and it just reaches. So it's perfect for this LR4. So while I cut away, one of the sides popped off. So cool beans, it's working. So just some things to be aware of when we set this up. We want to be lifting on the supercharger itself, because that's where those dowels are, down in there. We do not want to be lifting out here on the air intakes, because those are just bolted to the supercharger. And if you lifted this and you're lifting here, you torque this and you bend it all up, and we don't want to do that. So you gotta lift in the right spots. Then this is the mating surface where the intercooler is going to go down. We don't want to scratch that up. And so what I did is I had a rubber washer, and if you can see that, I cut a rubber washer into quarters. So the rubber washer is down against the mating surface to avoid scratches. Then there's the chain, and I had some fender washers that I drilled out. And then those are the intercooler bolts, and those are all the way down as far as they go. And lots of threads down there, so we don't have to worry too much about damaging the threads. And then it comes down to making sure the chain stays put when you lift up, because you see this chain comes up and it goes on here, and it's angled up. And at first time I tried that, the chain just slid off. So you need to hook it here and then loop it around and then hook it on the other one on the other side. And that took a little bit of time. So now you can see it's coming apart. Here's the block, and here's the air intakes that are bolted to the supercharger, and there's a nice space in there, so that one's coming up. This one here actually released first. I can just feel that the end of the screwdriver goes in there, so it's coming along. So what I do is I tighten and wait, and tighten and wait. So now we wait some more, and we will slowly work it up, and it's going to come up, and eventually it will come off. But there is absolutely no way on God's green earth that would have come out without this engine hoist. Well, cool. I was just tightening this one here on the left, and all of a sudden the whole thing just went pow! It popped right off, and as you can see, it's totally released. All the weight is now on the engine hoist. Well, it's out. Hallelujah. So it is a bit heavy, but it's certainly doable by one person, not a problem. So here it is on the workbench. Actually, it's the table saw with a nice soft towel. Just a final comment about removing the supercharger. You can see those 2 dowels on the bottom, and we will talk more about those when it comes to installation time. But there's one. And I want to point out something over here in the engine. And this is true on both sides. We're just looking at the driver's side. The dowel goes in here, and here's an anti-knock sensor. And so you don't want to pick up the supercharger and then put it down on your anti-knock sensors. And here it is over on the passenger side. Same thing. Anti-knock sensor very close to the dowel. So when you pick it up, it's got to come straight up and out and not be put down on your sensors, or you'll snap those off and break them and have to replace those. Well, now that the supercharger and the air intakes are off, it gives us a chance to evaluate where we are and where we go. And probably the single most important thing right now is these are our lint-free microfibers, and these are the air intakes, and those lead directly to the valves and to the cylinders. We want to keep all foreign material out of there. And speaking of foreign material, the deeper we get, we keep finding it. Now, you know, I think about that. We've got the appearance cover, we've got the intercooler, we've got the supercharger. We have limited airflow back here, and there is grit way the heck down there. And interestingly enough, we've also got some acorns back there. For the time we have owned this truck, it has always been in the garage. And I wonder if maybe previous owner kept it outside for a bit. I don't know, but surprise, surprise. So let's get out the shop vac and clean up again. Okay, so here we are. We're looking down the air intakes at the intake valves. And, you know, the phone doesn't want to focus, so I'm sorry, because they're down there. But you can see the carbon buildup on those valves. And that happens because the oil, as we've been talking, the oil mist comes up out of the valve covers, through the turbocharger, through the air intakes, and down into the cylinders, and it crosses over these intake valves, and the intake valves are hot. And so the oil builds up on those after a while, and you get these carbon deposits. There are plenty of people online who'll give you advice on how to clean that up. I'll leave that to you to take care of on your own. My approach here will probably be to run a can of turbocharger and intake valve cleaner through the air intakes. Of course, the trick is that it's got to be running to do that, and I'm not taking it all apart to see what it looks like when it's done. So all you can do is hope that they're not selling us a bunch of snake oil. Just a small aside here. When you get back here, you find this little vent pipe, and there's actually two of them, and the bottom one is down there. And, you know, they feel open on the end to me. There may or may not be something inside, I don't know, but they feel open. And when you follow those down, they go down there. And that's the transmission. So you wonder why we change our transmission fluid from time to time? Because we have these vent pipes. They do not appear to be sealed. And as we have demonstrated, there is fine particulate all over this guy. And I have no doubt that some of that dust can get up and get down where it doesn't belong. But before we do that, I want to take a look and see if we can learn a little bit more about this leak. And it's wet down there, that's for sure. And you can see it. So coolant down there could, I suppose it could come from this joint on the top, between the top and bottom crossover pipe. It can come from where the lower crossover pipe goes down into the block. It could come from the oil cooler. This is called the oil cooler pipe. It could come from either end of that and then leak down. But it's interesting. You see, it's not on the outboard side, which means it's not coming from the water pump. So that's interesting. So it's coming from one of those places. I'm gonna switch over and do this under UV light, so hang on. Okay, so remember when we were way out, we were looking right down the oil filter, and we saw that little triangle down there, that's coolant. And anything that's yellow, there we go, is coolant. Lots of it. And it's back in here, back in there. Well, good afternoon. How are you today? It's a late start today. Had some other things going on. So the next step is to take this plastic cover off of the wiring harness, and that is really just taken out to give us better access back there to the crossover pipe. So I'll show you this as best I can. It's a little challenging. There are 4 clips on the cover. If I pull this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and you unclip those, and the cover comes back. Then there's a zippy tie here, this wiring harness, and over on the other side, there's a zippy tie here. And when we take a look down inside, there's a zippy tie there, and a zippy tie there. Then there's this back here, and this just slides in. It's just storing this. It doesn't connect to anything. And then over on the other side, there's another zippy tie for that wiring harness. And then there's this big one here. You can either cut this off and rewrap it, or you can try and finagle that Christmas tree connector out from down there. Either one. Okay, so I learned something as we did this. So the gray Christmas tree one goes right here, and then behind it, immediately behind it, so you can't see it until this one's out, is another one. And I have one of these pliers, and that works great for getting in there and just backing them off. Okay, so here the plastic box is out, and over on this side, there was a wiring harness, there was a zippy tie here. Over on this side, facing us, there's a wiring harness, the zippy tie there. Then it's in the engine like that, but we're going to turn it like this so we can see what's going on. There are 4 clips that hold this cover back. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then down inside, there's a big wiring harness, and that is held to the plastic cover with 2 zippy ties, one here and one here. And there's the big wiring bundle with the gray fir tree, and that goes down here. And then on the back side, there was another wiring harness with a fir tree connector here and here. Okay, so let's take a look at the things that are physically attached to the rear crossover pipe. There is a wiring harness here with a fir tree connector. We come across this wiring harness here is attached with the fir tree connector, and that's on the back side of the rear crossover. There is another wiring harness symmetric on the passenger side with a fir tree connector. Then there is a small fir tree connector right here that holds this sensor. And this is a very easy connector to take apart. What you do is you press on the gray bit, but you press up here on the top. Boom, and that's off already. So let's, a little tight there, isn't it? Okay, not bad. So you press up here on the top side, and that comes right off. Then here was where that coolant hose came off. That comes from the intake manifold. Then over here, there's another coolant hose, and this hose here is on a bracket, and it's hard to get off. So what we need to do, this is the last thing that will come apart. We will squeeze together on the blue things, and this will slide off and come apart. And so we need to unbolt the crossover pipe from the block before we do that, so everything moves. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm making sure that we can actually get in there with a torque wrench and get these T30s back in place and retorque everything. And so this is the new rear crossover pipe, and that's the configuration. And this is exactly how it goes in the engine. And on the driver's side here, you can get in there with a torque wrench very easily. And over there on the passenger side, we have this bracket here. So it's a little more challenging, but this is what I came up with. So on the passenger side, where the bracket is, you can put a swivel in, and it's about that much off center. It's almost perfectly straight, but you just cannot quite get the head in. And then for the other 5, you can take the swivel off and just put this directly on the torque wrench, and it works just fine. This is a relatively small torque wrench. I got this at the bike shop. There's the part number for the rear crossover pipe, which has now been removed. And when I do a visual inspection on the old one, I see no problems with the plastic. I see no structural defects or failures. It's just fine. But 2 things that I want to point out here. So the gaskets here actually had welded themselves to the back of the block. So when the crossover pipe came off, the gaskets remained on the back of the block. So I need to go back there yet and clean up those mating surfaces and make sure that those are in good shape. Now this vehicle is a 2016, and it is now almost June of 2022. So it's that many years old, and it has just a touch over 60,000 miles. And I want to point out how much that gasket has been compressed. That gasket's all the way in there, and that's not a whole lot of gasket left doing its job. So here's the new one, and the new one comes with the gaskets, comes pre-installed with the gaskets. And let's take a look at, here we go. That's what the gasket really should look like. So I suppose the failure mode back here is eventually there's just not enough gasket resistance against the pressure, and it leaks out of the gaskets. So it looks like this was a good time to do this. Okay, so here we are on the passenger side on the block, and here I have a mirror. I'm using the light off the phone. And there is our mating surface, and it is nice and clean. I have burnished that with moderate to minimal pressure with a piece of 3000 emery cloth. And that is looking really good, as is the one on the driver's side. So that removal is done. Well, a very fine good morning to you today. How are you? Today in the United States, it's Memorial Day, and I would like to take a moment to remember and reflect. Here in the U.S., we mark Memorial Day with family, at the beach, at picnics, and cooking out. It's also the traditional first day of summer vacation. But Memorial Day is a whole lot more than that. Memorial Day is the day we remember all the brave men and women who died in the service of their country. The Merchant Marine, the Coast Guard, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. Okay, so our next step is to remove the bottom half of the front crossover pipe, which is of course right here. It attaches in two locations. Here's one, and the other one is over here in the shadows, right there. Those are T30s and 10 Newton meters. T30, 10 Newton meters. What I want to point out here is that the level of the front crossover, or the rear crossover pipe rather, is about here. And this is another couple inches further down. So any fluid, any coolant that might be trapped in the block that has not drained out is going to come out when we take the front crossover pipe. And I'm going to fill this up with rags to catch anything that comes out. But more importantly than that is to keep the cylinders closed, because if anything splashes up, we don't want coolant down in the cylinders. Okay, well, it came out relatively easily, and take a look at this. So here's the driver's side. As expected, that O-ring is pretty flat, and in a little bit I will compare that to the new one so you can see what the new one looks like. But let's look over here on the passenger side. My goodness, that is not pretty, and that is probably where our leak has been coming from. So let's go look in the engine real quick. I'm going to turn the camera sideways so we can keep out of the shadows. There's the driver's side. Looks like there's probably been some leakage going on and some seepage. But here's the passenger side, again the seepage, but more importantly there's the O-ring and the remainder of the plastic from the front crossover pipe. So I will clean all the coolant up, and then we'll stuff some rags down in there so that when we take that plastic and the O-ring out, that nothing gets down in the system. And of course we need to be very careful, go back over here, need to be very careful that we do not scratch up that mating surface. That needs to be nice and perfect. And of course there's more antifreeze on the garage floor, so we get to do that too. Okay, so I took a rubber glove and stuffed it down in there, and then the remaining bit of plastic and the O-ring just slid right out very easily with a couple of fingertips, no problem. We felt around down in there. There's no particulate that's loose, nothing that's going to get into the coolant system. So let's take a look at this. And there it is, and the O-ring would go there in the slot. And that's what we have. That failed, and it was seeping, and you never know when that could have gone catastrophic. So I'm really glad that we did that. And again, 60,000 miles. So I will show you the new part and the design changes in more detail when we do the install. But for right now, I just want to point out the O-rings and the state that the O-rings are in after about 6 years and 60,000 miles. The next step is to take the serpentine belt off of the water pump, and very similar to the other serpentine belt, there's a tensioner down here, but it is different. You notice the connector down there is four-sided, but this one is half-inch. So your half-inch breaker bar just pops right in. Notice that it does not go very deep, and I would really suggest having a little bit of extra oomph on there, a little piece of pipe so you can extend that handle. This one, like the other one, swings out towards the fender wall, and this one's under a fair amount more tension than the other one, so I will do that off camera. But when you do that, it releases the tension and it pops right off the water pump. Okay, so that belt came off really easily, but look at what the doofus did. Our little plastic elbow got broken by the breaker bar. So it's a darn good thing I was planning on replacing that anyhow, because I snapped it off. The next thing to do is take the tensioner off, and I will show you why in just a second. but the tensioner, that's a 13 millimeter, 40 Newton meters. 13 millimeters, 40 Newton meters. And the reason it has to come off is that bolt on the water pump doesn't quite clear. Okay, so the tensioner is off, and there are no washers or anything on here. And I just want to show you on the back side of the tensioner, there's two little locating pins, and those go in right here, that little half crescent, and that little half crescent right there. So there's no way you can put that back in the wrong way around. So we are about to take out the water pump, which is the last piece to come off. How about that? So the water pump is attached to the block with 4 bolts, 1, 2, and the bottom one there was the one that was just kind of behind the tensioner, and over here 3, 4. Those are T30s, and those are 12 Newton meters. T30s and 12 Newton meters. Just real quick on the right tool for taking the water pump off. You really need a T30 that's on a 4-inch socket that's built into the socket, and that helps you with the geometry. So when the water pump comes off, we are going to disturb this little tube, and that's called the oil cooler tube because that's the oil cooler. And it's hard to see because it's down there and it's all black. So I'm going to show you on the new one. So this is the new one. And first of all, the oil cooler tube comes with this little O-ring. But on the other side, there is a gasket that helps the oil cooler tube seal to the oil cooler. That gasket is a separate piece part. Make sure you buy that. So notice here on this little crescent bit, it's got different thicknesses. Okay, so what you do is when you install it, this goes on with the thick bit up, and then it rotates. And the thick bit engages with a slot in the block so that it ends up with the thin bit up and this ridge being vertical. And I'm going to show you that here, because if you don't notice exactly what's going on, it's easy enough to get it wonkers. So that ridge is this ridge, and the thin part ends right there. So you want to try and match that orientation when you put it back together. And now the last bit we need to understand as we take the water pump off. So you would think that for that oil cooler tube, and it lines up a lot like that, to disengage from the water pump, you'd have to bring it back all the way. Well, you really don't. You only really need to bring it back to this O-ring. And the reason is because this gasket up here is pretty loosey-goosey, and so you can pull the water pump off and you can finagle this and it'll release here. And so the amount we really need to pull the water pump back is, a pinky. A pinky. And why is that so important? That is so important because this is the water pump and this is the viscous coupling for the fan. And we don't want to take this off, and we don't have to take this off. So, and here's our high-tech measurement system, and you can see that is a little bit more than a pinky, and I do mean just a little bit more, but it's just enough so that we don't need to take the fan off. Okay, so I apologize in advance if this gets a little bumpy, but I want to show this in real time. And I have unbolted the water pump, and I've pulled on it and it just popped right out, so it's loose. So if I'm right, all we need to do is pull it back. You see that clearance down there is tough. But you see it? There we go. And that's how easy it is. Easy enough I can do it in real time. Okay, so one of the gaskets came away with the water pump. I need to clean that up with a little piece of plastic trim tool. And the other gasket remained on the block. We'll need to take that off. And then here, this little black bit right here, that's that gasket. Make sure you take that off and replace that with a new one. So it's cleanup time again. Okay, so this is a bit of bonus material, and in this little bonus section we are talking about removing the viscous fan coupling and the fan. And as I've just shown you, we do not need to do that. But there are so many people with so many horror stories about it, I thought I'd put this in. So the very first thing here on the mechanics manual page are the tools that you need to do that. And as it turns out, those tools are readily available on Amazon, and I will put that information right here. Okay, so these are the tools as they arrive from Amazon, and I've put the part numbers on them. Those are Rover part numbers, and as you can see, they are a full 25.5 inches long. They're 5 millimeters thick. They are big and beefy and heavy. And for this project on this vehicle, we're going to use this one and this one. Okay, so as we film this, obviously that's where the water pump lives. There's the viscous cupping and there's the fan. And as you saw a minute ago, that was very, very easy. So I'm only showing this for reference if you ever need to do this. So we take this one and it slides down over this bolt here and it just jams in against the other two bolts. And let's see if I can do that with my left hand and do it reasonably quickly here. There, I guess it's that easy, it's in. Then this is the other one. And that just goes over that big, right there. And it is, just jig a little bit, and it's down. Two things to be aware of here. So once these wrenches are on here, you can crank the engine with the wrenches. And in the mechanics manual, it always says to do that in a clockwise manner. So make sure you're doing that in a clockwise manner. And also, you need to understand if that's a right hand or a left hand thread on that nut down there. On this vehicle, it is a right hand thread. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. I make no guarantees what it's going to be on your vehicle. However, it does seem to be generally true that the supercharged vehicles are right-hand threads and the non-supercharged vehicles are left-hand threads. But I absolutely leave that to you. And when it comes time to put that back together, that would be 65 Newton meters down there. A lot of torque on that. And how you would measure that with these wrenches, I have no earthly idea. But again, it's just in for your reference. We did not need to do this, obviously, on this project, and I'm very glad. Good morning, how are you today? And today we work on two side projects on the Supercharger. Supercharger is here on the bench. And the first project is changing the oil. And here is the drain plug where our Allen wrench is in. And that is a 3/16. So as strange as a 3/16 might sound on an all-metric vehicle, that's what it is. I am told here that all the oil lives back here in the gearbox. And when I go to take a look at the best way to get the oil out, you can flip this over, but the challenge then is that you have to flip this over and rest it so that it drains. These are mating surfaces. I don't want to mess those up. We have this, and I just think flipping it over is probably not the greatest idea. So what we will be doing is using a syringe and a piece of tubing and sucking it out. So I'll show you that in a second. Now I'm told that the volume in this gearbox is 151 milliliters as a brand new fill, and that these are also very sensitive to being overfilled. And obviously when you drain things out, you never get it all out. It will be on the gears. It might be hung up in parts that just don't drain. So we're not going to get 151 mils out. Probably the best thing to do is measure what we can get out and then put back exactly what we take out. But that's only true as long as it was filled right in the first place, which we hope so, and it is not leaking, which it is not. So we're going to take out the oil and put back exactly what we take out. So here are our tools for that. We have a syringe with a nice piece of Tygon tubing on the end, and that'll go down in there and we will suck out as much as we can get. And then we have a 100 mil graduate cylinder, and we will measure up what we get out, and then the oil will obviously go in our recycled oil containers. Okay, so I have evacuated the oil from the gearbox on the Supercharger, and this is what we have. Obviously, it has aged a little bit in its 60,000 miles and 6 years of use. And the new oil has no appreciable smell. The used oil, it smells pretty gruesome. And the best way I can describe it is nasty earwax smell. It's very unpleasant. Now, you can see here that we have 84 milliliters, and I was expecting 151. So I put in a call to Superchargers Online, and I spoke to Nurgle, and he spoke to the other folks there after I had sent them all the pictures of all the stickers and all of the casing marks on my Supercharger, and their collective response was, "Oh, it's one of those." Now, if you're watching this at this spot, you are like me, a Land Rover enthusiast, and we all understand that probably every one of these vehicles is a unique vehicle because they seem to be manufactured with whatever's laying around that day. So I think I got one of those Superchargers, and I got, oh, it's one of those. So I have enough volume here. I'm going to fill it up and then pull it back out, and we'll give it a flush. And then when we're done, I took out 84 mils, and we will refill it with 84 or 85. Probably 85 in the graduate, so we make 84 actually get in. Okay, so the flush is complete, and we put in 80 mils on a flush, and we pulled back out 80 mils. And we are now ready for our refill. Remember, I took out 84, and I have 85 in the graduate, and we'll pour it back in, and that 1 mil differential will cover the oil that doesn't drain out of the graduate and might not drain out of the funnel. And I failed to report earlier that the proper dry fill on this particular unit for this particular truck is 90 mils. So I would highly suggest when you do this, you make some phone calls and you give them every single number you find on here, all the stickers, all the casing marks, and double, triple, quadruple check the appropriate volume. Again, 90 mils on this particular vehicle. We got out 84, and I'm putting 84 back in. So the challenges continue with this Supercharger. Now we're taking off what's called the snout so we can get it at the coupler, because as I said, I found a video online that said that this is a problem. So when we get in there, we'll find out if that's true or not. But the snout comes off at this seam, and with this configuration there are 7 bolts, 3 on the top, 3 on the bottom, and 1 back there inside the throttle body. So there's 7. These are 10 millimeters, and there is no torque spec that I can find for this exact Supercharger. Superchargers Online says to use between 24 and 27 Newton meters. There's a Jaguar discussion group with a different Supercharger, and they have the drawings from Jag on that, and it says 27 Newton meters. So I think we'll probably go back with 27. So again, these are 10 millimeters and 27 Newton meters. And don't forget the one in there, or it ain't never coming apart. Okay, so those bolts all came out, no problem. So 6 bolts around the outside are like this. The one inside the throttle body is like that. There are some discussion groups that talk about using blue Loctite on the one inside the throttle body. I think that's a pretty good idea, because if that ever came loose and it came out, that would get sucked up in the vanes and that would destroy the turbocharger real fast. So I will use blue Loctite when I reinstall that. Now that one did not want to come out. It just kind of sat there. So I used one of these guys to get on it. And then once I got on it, I was able to just pull it out easily enough. Then this location here, we have this bit in the way. So I ended up using a 10 millimeter built into a swivel, and that worked very well. So the next step is to physically remove the snout from the main body. That's held down there with some RTV, and some folks say that it's a little challenging to get off, and we'll head off and do that next. Well, good morning once again, and let's take the snout off of the supercharger. So there's a small piece of 2x4 underneath just to lift this up off the bench, and then I have one of these little guys, nothing huge, just a little bitty pry bar. And to get oriented, here we are. Turns out that there's a pry spot right here. Just a little lip you can get on, and you just go in there and just apply a moderate amount of pressure, not even all that much, and off it comes. Okay, well, the snout's off, but of course there's a trick, and so I'm going to let you get oriented just for a second. We're looking down on the top of the snout as we would look down on it when it's in the engine. And I'm going to come around here and show you the mating surfaces. So, you know, the top would be up, and the bottom would be down. And we pried up here, and we pried that off, and it just released. And don't just take this and turn it down, because you're going to have a problem, and here's why. Because on the bottom, there's 2 dowels. There's a dowel here. This one came off with the snout. And there's a dowel on the other side, and that one stayed behind on the body. So obviously, if you go in here and you just angle that down to pull it off, hoping that there's just sealant, you're going to mess up the dowels. So it has to come straight off. Slide it straight off. In this case, because it's standing on end, it would be up, or if it's, you know, like it normally is, it would be straight out. Here's the snout again, and real quick, I want to show you the damage that happened when we pried that off. You see that little nick right there? It's not bad, and it is outside of the area where we will apply sealant, so it's not a problem. But obviously, don't go nuts putting stuff down in there, because that's a mating surface and it needs to be in good shape. You might recall, as I stated a couple times earlier, I had found a video that claimed that the jiggle in this pulley would be a problem. And I don't know if that's really true, but I know where it's coming from. It's not the coupler, it's the spring in the coupler. And I can see how that spring would eventually wear on the shaft. And I'm very happy to say that has not happened, so we're in good shape. The next step is to get everything ready for reassembly. So the first bit of that is to take our throttle body and use some throttle body cleaner and get this residue out of here. Remember, we're talking about the oil mist that comes off the valve covers, yeah? And it comes around through the air plenum, and it comes in here, and that gets in here, and it gets all sticky, and that'll obviously interfere with operations down there, so we clean that up with some valve cleaner. Then we had talked about this bolt that attaches the snout to the main supercharger, and we questioned whether or not that was carrying Loctite on it, and I think it has, because when I take a look at the threads, there's clearly a fair amount of material in the threads, so I think that's Loctite. So I will clean this up, and then we'll run this in and out a few times to clean the threads and get it ready to put back together. then the next step is to take all this grease out. And again, I need to shout out to Superchargers Online and Nurgle and the folks over there who have told me in no uncertain terms that this grease comes with the original coupler. It comes with the spring. And you can see this, it pulls off really easy. And there's lots of grease down in there. And the new coupler is solid, so we don't need this grease. So we can go ahead and clean everything up. Before I remove it when I'm cleaning up, I just need to point out how very frugal they were with the sealant on this. It's a very small bead, and actually in the instructions they say to apply a 1 millimeter bead of sealant, and that's about what they did. And it's not on every surface here because some of it came off with the snout. It's all nice and clean. Isn't that pretty and shiny? So cool. But let's talk about that just for a second and how we get there. The proper solvent is throttle body cleaner, because we don't want to get too aggressive, because I don't know what's back there. I don't know what's back there. We have a sensor here that goes through. We have electronics and sensors, and so throttle body cleaner is made to be in these chambers, and so I'm assuming that it's going to be okay. Now, getting that grease out in the very back was tough, and I have a whole bunch of, I call them Q-tips on a stick, and that's in the parts list, and that really helps getting back in there and getting all the gunk out. Now, I have purposefully not put this in the parts list, but these mating surfaces on both halves were very hard to get clean. And so I broke out something that's much, much more aggressive and really pretty dangerous stuff. Carb cleaner. And as you are well aware, if you are of any age, putting this stuff on anything that is not metal is going to be the end of it. So if you took that carb cleaner and you sprayed it in here and it got up on that sensor, or if there's something behind there and behind there, or you missprayed and you got it on here, that's the end of it. It's gone. So the way I did this gets sprayed on a rag, and then the rag is used to wipe this off. Careful, careful with this stuff. So earlier we had taken a look at the shaft where the spring goes for the coupler, and we had said that the shaft looked just fine, and indeed it does. But you take all the grease off, and look at that. So that spring has been slapping around in there and has worn a little bit on this shaft. And it's mainly cosmetic. I can feel really tiny indentations on that. I suppose technically it's out of balance, but I think we're just going to go with it. So let's take a look at the new coupler. This is the new coupler, and it just slides on, and that's it. And then when this goes the main supercharger, it's the same thing, and the fit is almost exactly the same as far as tightness, and we just rotate this until it lines up. And you notice that the coupler does not rest on the shaft at all, so that wear on the shaft, the only challenge with that will be out of balance, and like I said, I think we're just going to go with it. So the next thing to discuss is the sealant we're going to use to reseal this. So again, thanks to Superchargers Online and Nurgle and his folks. And they tell me that if you have an oil-filled system where this is oil-filled, then the proper sealant for that is Loctite 518 anaerobic. So again, if it's oil-filled, it's Loctite 518 anaerobic. Ours, however, is not. Ours is a dry system. And the proper sealant for a dry system is black RTB. And you need to make sure that it's sensor safe. So again, for our dry system, the black RTV and sensor safe. Just a last few details. So recall that we have these dowels, and there was the one that stayed behind on the main body, and then the other one came off and it remains on the snout. Because those are dowels and they might have a tendency to freeze up, I'm going to put a little copper anti-seize on those, just so whoever gets into this next can get those back apart. Then recall that this bolt that we get at through the throttle body comes through, appeared to have some blue Loctite on it, so we're going to hit that guy with blue Loctite. And then finally, as I said, I do not have a torque diagram for this. I do not know what the order is because I just can't find it. But in the diagram in the Jaguar manual for the other supercharger, it does indicate that the bolt that we get at through the throttle body is position 1. So we'll go with that bolt for position 1, and then after that we'll just get creative with a star crisscross pattern. Okay, so applying a 1mm bead did not work out. It was too generous. So nothing like a finger to smear it around. Let's get that together before it starts to set. So everything is back together, and just to say it one more time, those are 10mm and 27 Newton meters. And now when we turn our pulley, everything is nice and tight the way it should be. Now we can move on to putting things back on the engine. On the rear crossover, I just want to compare the old one and the new one regarding design changes. I have taken a look. I see absolutely 0 design changes. And the one thing that we're all concerned with is this seam. And the new one is exactly the same as the old one. So it still has the seam. The only difference, of course, is that we have new O-rings. Okay, so it's time to reinstall the new rear crossover pipe, as we call it, or the heater manifold, as Rover calls it. So again, these are T30s, 10 Newton meters, and that's the configuration. Then we have some wiring harnesses that attach with Christmas tree connectors. One here, one here, one here, and one here. And then that electrical connector goes here, and the cooling line goes there. This will be the cooling line that comes back out all the way to the front to the intake manifold, and we will not do that until we put the turbocharger back on. Okay, so the rear crossover pipe is done. All of the wiring harnesses have been reattached where they need to go. As you can see, the plastic box over the wiring harness is back in place and zippy tied down. Good afternoon, how are you this fine day? And right now we are looking at the new water pump and the new bits and pieces and about to do that reinstall. So let's take a look at what's going on and the design changes that we may or may not have found. So there's the tube that leads into the oil cooler, and on that tube goes a gasket, and there's the gasket that is exactly the same as the old version. Then the next bit out is the oil cooler tube that looks exactly the same as the old version, with the exception that the gasket O-ring that's down here looks to be a little bit different. The old one is pretty highly compressed, so it's a little hard to make that judgment, but it looks like this is a different gasket. Then comes the water pump, and this is exactly how it comes when you get it. It comes with the new bolts and the gaskets already in place and installed. And there is the part number for that. Is obviously the water pump, and right there is the location where this little plastic bit slides in. It can be taken out, but it is a little bit challenging. What you need to do is push in on the black bit, and then as you're pushing in on the black bit, at the same time you're pushing that in, you can pull this out. So as we actually go to reinstalling the water pump, again, here's the viscous coupler for the fan, and remember that the clearance was a pinky, and we need to be able to angle that water pump as we slide it in. And to do that, we need to make sure that our O-rings don't bind, because if they bind, they can get twisted and then we'll have leaks. So on the outside of this gasket and on the inside of the tube, we'll put some coolant just to give it a little bit of lubrication. Then on this O-ring and on the inside of the water pump, again, some coolant just to give it some lubrication so that we have that ability to move things around. Just a reminder that these are T30s and 12 Newton meters. And there are stories of folks online who have installed this. It has not leaked, but they didn't install it properly, and it was just a little bit, I'll exaggerate of course, it was just a little bit off kilter. And of course, when you get the serpentine belt on there, and if it's off kilter even a tiny bit, that's going to come flying off. And the collateral damage when that comes off on your electrical connectors and on your wiring will be significant. So make sure that the pump goes on, and it goes on perfectly square. Let me point out exactly how this oil cooler tube goes on. So the slot I talked about is really on the V8. Here on the V6, it's just this space between this knob and this lip, but that is our retaining slot. So this goes on with the thick bit up, and you get it in, and you're going to get this thin bit down in there, and then once it's on, it rotates, and you get that extra thickness, and that engages down there and it holds it in place. And remember, we want it with that orientation so that line is straight up and the edge of the thin bit is right about there. Okay, so there was a little glitch putting the water pump back on. Turns out that one of the bolts from the vendor was boogered up on the end, so we needed to fix those threads. But other than that, it was smooth sailing. Our next step is the tensioner, and I have already taken the belt and made sure the belt is going in all the right places. And what you do is you pre-slot the tensioner in with those little nubs. The bolt obviously is not tightened yet, and you wrap the belt around the tensioner. And then of course, that's where it will go eventually on the water pump. So this is again 13 millimeters and 40 Newton meters. So we will bolt that up. We'll put our breaker bar in there. We'll swing the tensioner to release the tension, and we'll get it on all the pulleys. Then we will double, triple, and quadruple check that it's on all the pulleys in the right locations and that it is properly installed everywhere so it doesn't come flying off. And I'll put the diagram here in next so you can take a look at that. And the belt went on just fine, and most of the pulleys are like this, so it's really hard to get that on wrong. The only place where it takes a little bit of adjusting is down here on the tensioner, because you have the tensioner on the flat side of the belt, and you just do that by feel and you get the spacing right on both sides of the belt. Let's compare the top and bottom half of the front crossover, old and new. So this is the top half, and here we go. So the old one is here in front. It has that seam, And as we've talked about, I see no problems with this one at all. And here's the new one. The new one is all one continuous part. There is, well, there's a tiny seam on there, but it's very different. It feels much more robust. And the design change here is down on this end, and this is the end where it meets the lower, and it's considerably longer. So let's move over to the lower. Here's the part number. Here's the old one. Again, it's got a very simple seam, if that isn't glued just right. And the new one, you know, it's got a seam on it again, but it is considerably different. And then the design change is again up on this end where they come together. And you notice there's not a little clip, and without that little clip, we're just depending on the geometry to put those together when everything goes back together. And at this spot, I can point out that both the upper and the lower have O-rings, of course, and they come pre-installed. And on the upper, there is that bleeder port. That bleeder port is a separate part number, and get a new one because the old bleeder port is just plastic, and you know, for $5, it's more than worth getting some fresh plastic on that. The next bit is the lower front crossover pipe. There's only one way that can go in, and it just fits down in there. We will lubricate those O-rings with some coolant so they slide on easily, and then it's T30 and 10 Newton meters. Okay, well, let's look at this from another angle. Obviously, this is the supercharger here, and it's covered up. And out the back of the supercharger comes that coolant hose that comes from the throttle body. And this is the rear crossover pipe, and it slips into those, and then it slides on the barb, and then we get at that hose clamp with a little 5-inch vice grips. And then remember that the box for the wiring harness lives about here. So the challenge is exactly how do you get down to get to that, and whether or not we put this bracket on first. And so here's more or less what it looks like with the bracket out of the way. Remember, we have that plastic bit here. We know from experience we can get in here, just get a vice grips on here and make that work. If that bracket is in place, that takes up all of our space because here's the plastic box and we just can't get in there. So I do believe that we will go ahead, put the supercharger down, reinstall the coolant hose, and then when that's done, then we'll install the bracket. And this bolt here is easy enough to get to. The one on the other side is the hard one. Remember, that's the one with the 1-inch T30 on the vice grips. And you have that electrical little bit hanging here that connects, so it gets very busy. It's kind of tight. So I think that's what we're going to do. Install this first, install the bracket second. So we are working our way to reinstalling the supercharger. There are several steps along the way that we need to take a look at. So I have cleaned the mating surfaces, and these are our alignment pins, and there's 4 locations where the intake manifolds are going down. And you notice that these are in 1 and 3, and if you count from the back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 3 on both sides. Those are finger tight. Next step is to put the intake manifold gaskets in place, and this is how they come from Rover. We need 2 of those. So just so you can see, here's the new one. And you can see the ridge here, and I can feel it with my finger. Here's the old one. No ridge left and pretty smashed flat. So best to get new ones. Here we are at the underside of the supercharger, and remember we had those dowel pins, and as it came out we have some corrosion going on, and that's how it looked when it came out, in a few minutes with some 600 grit emery cloth, and it shines up real nice. So we'll shine those both up, and then we will hit it with some copper anti-seize so that it hopefully comes apart a little bit easier next time. So we're still on the underside of the supercharger, and this time we're working on the coolant line. That line runs from the throttle body, and it runs all the way back and down, and eventually it ends up on the rear crossover pipe. And we have some clips down here that need to be replaced. 1, 2. And you can see they're both broken. They shatter very, very easily because they are so brittle from being down here from the heat. There's the part number. And here is one of them. And it slides on like that. Match the orientation. And then we have these nice little lines on the hose that tell us exactly where the hose needs to be. And that holds the hose up off of the oil cooler so we don't cook that rubber any more than necessary. And lastly, we need to clean these mating surfaces, and then we are ready to pick this up and put it in place. And I have arranged for a spotter because I do not want to put this down on one of those alignment pins, say here, and scratch my mating surfaces. I want to make sure that when I put it down, it goes right in the hole. So my daughter's going to help me out and be my spotter. Well, that went back in just superbly. And this is something you can do alone. You do not need a spotter. It was helpful, but certainly not necessary. So we're going to go ahead and install those 6 bolts. We have the center 2 here and here. Just started. Those are 10 millimeters and 25 Newton meters. So just a word about the torque order. There is no specific torque order on this. It is very loosey-goosey. All it states is these 2, then these 2, then these 2. Other than giving us pairs, it does not specify an exact order. So I will, I'll crisscross. Okay, our air intakes have been bolted down, and that went just fine. Now remember, our cylinders are still open to the world. We need to keep junk out of all of our intake locations so we don't get things down in our system. And we have some work to do in the back. And the next bit is that coolant hose. And rather than fight that when it's down in there, I've already put the vice grips on the clamp so that we can just reach down in there. And there is just enough space to get in there and make that happen, not a problem. And again, we don't want to be leaning on this and snapping it off. So we need to be paying attention to where we put our arms and our weight. Okay, so right now it's getting exciting because it's going back together, and it's like, well, I do this and this and this and this and this. And we need to restrain ourselves and make sure we don't make mistakes, because it would be so easy just to slap the intercooler on now and move on. But that's not the correct order. And have you figured out what the correct order is? Do you remember what we spent about 5 hours finagling with? That electrical connector down there, yeah? So before we lose track of that electrical connector, what do you say we do that right now? And that should click together. If it would focus, there we go. Being a little difficult. Don't see why. There we go. And I don't know if the camera picked it up, but I heard it and felt it click. So we are going to stay strictly with our order of operations so we don't forget things like that. Good morning. It's another fine day, and how are you? So let's take a look at the next step, and the next step is figuring out the order of operations for this. We could install the intercooler first and then put the bracket on top of the intercooler, or we can install the bracket first and slide the intercooler underneath. And obviously, because the bracket's already here, that shows you what I've decided to do, but I've left the bolts loose, so that'll give us plenty of space. And then remember that that bracket hangs on the back of the supercharger at this standoff here and at this standoff here. Then there's that yellow fir tree that holds that wiring bundle, and below that just see there's an alignment pin, and further down there's another fir tree connector that holds whatever that gray bit was back there. And then this electrical will stay loose because that gives us some access to get our hand back in there. So when you install those bolts, obviously be very careful, because if you drop them, they are gone and they are not coming back. Well, it's time to reinstall the intercooler, but I've learned that all those rubber bits that I thought were just glued to the intercooler are really part of one great big gasket, and it's pretty rigid. And the instructions at this point would say to take our alignment pins and put them at positions 17 and 10 back there in the corner. And as we discussed a long time ago, I would have to cut those alignment pins down. And I think we can take this shortcut. The alignment pins fit really nice in the positions 21 and 22 at just the right height. This is really rigid. I'm going to carefully align that with where it needs to go. And then I'm going to just try and put the intercooler on top of that without putting any alignment pins in the back. And we'll see how it goes. Well, that idea worked just beautifully, and that's because that gasket is very rigid and the intercooler itself is very easy to handle because it's light. So it is down, everything is bolted down and torqued. So remember that the center four are 10 millimeters. Everything around the outside is T40s, and all the torques on those are 25 Newton meters. And I'll put the torque diagram right here for reference. Time to finish up the rear bracket. At that standoff back there, that's a T30, and that's 12 Newton meters. It's also extremely tight back there, so I'm just going to get it tight. Then there's the box that goes around the harness, and that bolts down. That's a T30s, and there is no known torque spec that I can find. And finally, the electrical connector goes back on the slider. Getting at those T30s that hold the bracket to the supercharger is tight. On the passenger side, I ended up using a 4-inch T30 on my smallest socket. And then on the driver's side, I ended up using a 1-inch T30 on a 5-inch vice grips. And then the T30s that hold the box down to the bracket, those are pretty easy to get at. You can just go in there with a standard socket. Well, the next one is this vent line here, and there are a couple of Christmas tree connectors that go on the bracket, and then it connects right there. It just slides on and clicks in. That's quick and dirty. And then after that, the appearance cover bracket goes in, and that's back there, and that is 8 millimeters and 10 Newton meters. 8 millimeters, 10 Newton meters. Well, the next bit is the top half of the front crossover pipe, and that goes right down in there. And then there's 2 T30s at 10 Newton meters. And my biggest concern about this is that junction back in there. because there's nothing holding that together except for geometry. There's no clips, there's no clamps, it's just geometry. So we'll see how that goes together. So I will put some coolant on that O-ring to give us some lubrication, and we'll do that. So there's the front crossover pipe, and there is a bleeder port, and that is an accident just waiting to happen. So let's remember to put that bleeder port cap on. There's the part number. All it does is snap on. But boy, it would sure be embarrassing if we forgot that, wouldn't it? There's our little bleeder valve, and that's what it looks like after it's been snapped into place. Just rotate it around so you can see that too. Now we're on to some electrics. Remember, we have this electrical connector. This will slide on, and then the red one locks it in place. We have a new zippy tie fir tree connector there, and we have this one and this one. Those will both slide into place and click. Do not do these two. The fuel line needs to go in first. This is the next one, and recall that this one goes here, then this goes in under this foam. This bit here slides over that bit right there. There's an electrical connector that goes down and under, and it comes back up on top. There's no easy way to show you that, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. The next bit coming up is the fuel line, and to get on the fuel line we need a 17mm crow's foot. That's what that looks like, and that goes on the end of the torque wrench, and that increases the moment arm on the torque wrench by that much. So we need to recalculate the torque. So we come down here and we can trace that out. Then you can measure the distance. And that distance is 7/8 of an inch. So now we go to the internet and we find a little calculator. There are plenty of calculators online to help you do this. I like this one. So we put in the specified torque, which is 21 Newton meters. That is a 10-inch torque wrench. That length was 7/8 of an inch. And so we need to apply 19.5 Newton meters. And I'll be the first one to agree that the difference between 19.5 and 21 is very academic, but that's how it's done, and you never know when you're going to need to do it, and it's really going to count. Now we're on to these bolts, which are little brackets that hold the fuel line. There's 4 of these. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're T30s. The specified torque is 8 Newton meters. I would certainly not run out and buy a special torque wrench for that. If that 10 Newton meters is the best you can do, I think that's just fine. Now we can move on to the last of the electricals. Remember this little guy, and that's a Christmas tree fitting down below. And so we just push it in. Then this one slides in, and then the gray bit slides up to lock it in place. So the next line is the vent line that connects right here, and that connects with a very satisfying snap. And we need to watch how that is routed. That is over the electrics, under these coolant tabs, under this line, and then that'll take you around to the back side of the valve covers. And then there's this little guy that'll clip onto there. Now comes this vent line that attaches to the air plenum up here, and this runs back over the fuel line, and then it goes underneath our foam rubber. I'm going to peel it back so you can see it. It comes back, and it keeps on going back, and it connects to the valve cover gasket back there. So here's our line coming back up out of the foam. There's a little bracket here and it just slides in, and the bracket goes under this line and attaches here with a T30. There is no known torque for that. And then it connects to the other line right here, and there's one of those blue push tabs. So now we reinstall our serpentine belt onto the supercharger, and again it's our 1/2-inch breaker bar. Remember, on this one there's an adapter down to 3/8, so we need that adapter down to 3/8. You need a little extra oomph on the handle, and remember this one pushes out towards the fender wall. When you do that, it releases the tension on the belt and you can put it where it needs to be. But this mass airflow sensor is very close, so don't snap that off, don't bang it up, and I'll put the diagram in next. As before, make sure the belt's on properly. We do not want that flying off. On all the pulleys, it's almost impossible to get it on wrong, except down there on the tensioner. The tensioner is flat, so you need to make sure that it's well centered on the tensioner. And I am struck again by how much less tension there is on this serpentine belt than there is on the other one. One thing I just want to point out, if you haven't noticed it yet, on most locations there's a little tab, and that shows us how far to push the hose on. And on the hose there's a line, and that lines up with the tab, so we can get the hose on at the correct depth and at the correct rotation. Well, let's go ahead now and do the top radiator hose. Of course, this goes to the radiator. This end here goes to the front crossover pipe. This little bit goes to a hose that's down there, and then those two coolant lines go to the intercooler, and let's make sure we put them on the right place. And they both say front, and those will just snap in and click in, and everything else are standard hose clamps. I'll go ahead and do that. Well, good morning everyone. How are you this fine day? So this is our project for today, which is reinstalling all the plumbing on the front of the engine. Let's take a look at what we'll be getting into today. And I think it might not be too bad, because you notice that all the clamps are blocked open. So I think it's just going to be a slide on and unclamp. And you'll notice that the clamps are attached to the hose with some RTV, so everything's in place, and all we need to do is go ahead and do that. So now this hose, remember, was a very expensive piece, and that's because this bit of plastic did not release from the thermostat. And at least per the dealership, once these go together, they're permanently attached. So as we do this, remember there's a wire bail on there. Pull the bail out, slide them together, and then clip them shut. So as we go further up the engine, so then this hose here goes here, and see it's blocked open. Then on this end, this essentially had welded itself to the water pump, and I had tortured the old piece quite a bit. I did not trust it, so we got a new one. Then here, and that does go over the top, I wanted this little plastic bit, and the only way you can get that is to buy this entire assembly. So I hope that because all these are blocked open, it will be a reasonably straightforward day. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about this just for a second. There's going to be this hose here, and this hose here, and this clamp down here. And I find that I do not have pictures because this is below the thermostat. It's relatively far down. I don't have any pictures or video of that. So I will post right here the plumbing diagram, and I will leave it to you to note where these hoses run. In other words, do they run on the outbound side of these hoses, or do they run on the inbound side of these hoses, so you can get the routing right. Well, it's coming along. I just want to point out this trick. And here is an extension, and an extension, and an extension, and eventually they get down right there. And that's that T30 on the thermostat. And that is the easiest way to get on that. So all of that plumbing went back together. And I would love to say it was oh so much fun, but it really was not. It wasn't real bad. It was better than taking it apart, but this is just not fun stuff to work on. So the air plenum has been slotted in place loosely over the throttle body. It is still loose. It has not been tightened down anywhere yet. And we have done that before the last of the coolant lines for the intercooler, because this is that vent line that comes from the back of the valve covers, and it connects to the air plenum right there. You really, really need to be able to get a hand on that to snap that back together. So the proper order here is air plenum, then coolant lines. Okay, so those coolant lines have been reinstalled, and I've got the flashlight shining on that vent line from the valve cover, and you can see that those coolant lines are right in front of it. So the coolant lines are back, and they have been snapped and clicked into place at all the appropriate locations. Notice that this line goes underneath here, and then it stays in the front of the other one, and it slots in there, and then it connects. And you notice that it says rear on it, so it goes to the rear connector. And this one does say rear on it. It's just right there. You can't read it. It says rear, and it goes to the rear connector. Now, when those four went back on, only one of them really snapped nicely. The other three went on, and they're fine. But I'm going to keep a special eye on those for a while to make sure that I'm confident with all of those. So, and on the other side, just want to point this out. They come down, and they go back into that connection down there. And then I redid this, and I want to point out that this line goes over the intercooler lines. And just like that, it's back together. Boy, I sure hope I did it right. So anyhow, on the air plenum, there's two hose clamps here. There's the two on the other side, of course. And then there's the one on the throttle body right down there. Those are all 3.5 Newton meters. And there's the one bolt, and that is 10 millimeters and 10 Newton meters. So on we go to filling it up with coolant. Well, how are you today? And on this end of the project, it is discouraging. As you can see, the air plenum is back off, and that is because we have a pressure leak. So I pumped this up to about 13 pounds, and this is the third time I've done it. And even in the few seconds I'm recording this, you can see that needle move just ever so slowly. You know, I made up some soapy water with a paintbrush, and I've been looking for leaks at all the places that I can at least get to. Have not found anything yet. Well, here we have a vacuum check, and the system is vacuum tight. It holds vacuum just fine. But of course, you know, a vacuum and pressure are two very different functionalities on all the fittings. But normally we would just do a vacuum check and then refill with antifreeze and move forward. Here's our coolant again, Land Rover coolant, of course. And remember that the Land Rover coolant has the dye built right in, so if indeed we have some leaks, that will help us diagnose. And that's already made up at 50/50, and I know I do not need to tell you, but of course you make it up with distilled water. So if you've never used a vacuum refill apparatus on a vehicle, we're going to talk about that for a few minutes. The first thing you need is an air compressor. You don't need infinite air, you don't need high volumes, you just need a little bitty guy like this. And if you run out of compressed air, you just close all your valves, refill your tank, and then start again. It's not a big deal. So here's our air pressure line. Comes up and back down. We have an on-off valve. And so the air blows down here, and that makes a vacuum. The Venturi effect makes a vacuum here. We turn the vacuum on, and if we open this valve, we can suck up coolant. There's a bottle of coolant. And we can suck up coolant up the line and fill the line. And what happens then is it comes back in here, and of course it gets caught in the Venturi and it comes down here. And it sprays out all over creation unless you do this. You need this hose going down, just do a little catch bottle. Just so you don't spray antifreeze all over the engine. So once we have that done, we can fill up this line, we can close this off, we can turn on the vacuum again, and we can suck up all the air out of our system. And you can buy any number of little vacuum setups like this, and they come in all different price ranges. The only thing you really need for this is that right there, and that's in the parts list, and that screws on to our reservoir, and it's about 15 bucks or so when you buy it as a standalone. So I have done that, and I have sucked coolant up this line up here, and it moves, even when you're very careful with the valves, it moves very quickly, and it comes shooting down there, so you really need that catch basin. So now all I'm going to do is turn this back on, turn this on, and we evacuate the system. Okay, I've evacuated the system, and now all we do to fill it up is we turn this valve. And away we go. And we can watch the volume go down. Obviously, we need to make sure that we don't suck up air with this. And we fill the system until we run out of vacuum or until the reservoir shows it's at the full level like it usually does. Now, as this is going, you can do this multiple times. You do not need a dead empty system to do this. In fact, when I did the same thing on the 2013, I needed to vacuum and refill 3 separate times. So you can certainly do this when there's coolant in the system. Okay, well, you can see the fill level there is about where it needs to be, and that happens right when the vacuum runs out. Ended up putting about 7 quarts in, which is considerably more than I was expecting. I was expecting maybe 4.5 quarts. Well, as you can see, the air intake plenum has been reinstalled. All of our tools have been removed, and we are in a configuration that we are ready to start this. Of course, it's going to start hard because that fuel line is empty, right? But once it starts, and I say this because this did happen with the 2013. On the 2013, the coolant in here was sucked into the engine almost instantly, and then the low coolant alarm, which lives way down in the bottom, gave us an alarm. If that happens, we will of course turn the engine off immediately, re-vacuum, refill. Remember, once it gets hot, it needs to be totally cold before we can ever open it again. Okay, we are truly finally getting to the end. So we are going to start this up, and then we are going to keep a close eye on the low coolant alarm in case that happens. We're going to keep a really close eye on the temperature gauge to make sure we don't have anything strange going on there. Next thing we're going to do is raise this up out of access height to regular height so I can get underneath and take a look at those hoses and have some room to work. So here are the Rover instructions for doing the bleed when you do a vacuum fill, and I'll put those in the next pane so you have those as well. Turn the heater to high, idle it until you get hot air. I know from experience you might need to bump the RPM a little bit to make that happen. Once you get hot air out of the ducts, turn the heater off. Take it to 2000 RPM and hold it there for 8 minutes. Turn the engine off, let it get totally cold, check the volumes and top up as necessary. Well, good morning yet again. So those scenarios that we were concerned about yesterday did not happen, and that is absolutely great. But we did have something else happen that we were not expecting. We never got heat out of the heater, and the engine was plenty warm. The temperature gauge looked fine. We were moving the RPMs up and down. Yesterday I thought maybe it was vapor locked. So I turned it off. I figured we'd let it get cold, take a look at it again in the morning. So this morning there is still coolant in the reservoir. I will re-vacuum and refill that one more time just to be on the safe side. Probably not necessary. But last night it struck me. When I was young, you had a little slider and you moved the slider and the vehicle gave you heat. In this guy, right there, we turn the knob, right? Goes to 84 and the next click just says high. So what is that, maybe 86? Well, that might be fine when you're sitting in Solihull, England. But when you're here in Houston in the summertime in the garage, even with the door open to the kitchen, it's 90 degrees in the garage. So I guess maybe that's why we never got any heat out, because it was fully satisfied and it didn't want any more heat. So the door to the kitchen has been open all night, and we've been letting the garage cool off, and it feels very nice in here. But I take my little temperature gauge there, and the inside of the truck still says 83. And the highest that goes is 84, maybe 86 if that next click is really another 2 degrees. So I've got one chance at this, because once we run the truck, it's going to heat up in here again. So we'll give it another try this morning. We'll see if we can get heat out of the heater. I think either way, we're just going to go ahead and run it at 2000 RPM for those 8 minutes and give it the run in. And we'll see what happens along the way. Well, okay, we got lots of heat coming out the heater vents, and the engine is barely even warm. We actually got heat out almost instantly. So now we're going to turn the heater off, and we're going to run her up to 2000 RPM, and we're going to hold for 8 minutes. And just some final comments. I am declaring the project complete. Hallelujah. So I have worked on this now for 16 calendar days in a row. Of those, 14 were actual hands-on wrench days. I have probably spent between 30 and 40 wrench hours, easily that many hours doing the videos. And there are some sections in there where we just burned hours like crazy. So there was that little electrical connector on the back of the supercharger. That took somewhere between 4 and 5 hours just for that electrical connector. So certainly now that you know all these tricks, you can do it a lot faster. Just some final things. Don't forget the shroud underneath. Don't forget the appearance cover on top. Don't forget to clean the antifreeze out of your vacuum tool so it's nice and clean for next time. I am aware this video is crazy long, but there's lots of good information, lots of good details. I hope you find it useful. Good luck when you do this project. Have a great day.